What up, Ho Biscuits? It's your girl Skitten, back at it again. First and foremost, I hope you guys are doing well. I hope you guys are staying safe and sanitized. We are back with Overly Sarcastic Productions. I took a little bit of a break, not because I don't love them or adore their content, but just because if I could, and if we're being really honest, every single reaction I did would be Overly Sarcastic Productions and like extra history and stuff like that. And I was like, okay, Skitten, like you gotta take a break. You gotta chill. You got to branch out, diversify your interests, which I don't like to do, but I will do. So if you guys have any suggestions of other channels, other content, please, when I'm saying to leave them in the comments below at the end of my videos, I mean that shit. I really and truly mean it. Like, leave it down in the comments below. I'm open to it, but I had to do this because Red decided to do a legend summarize of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the Epic of Gilgamesh was one of my favorites when I took World Lit in college. So I decided to go ahead and revisit Overly Sarcastic Productions, and this will probably instigate a slew of Overly Sarcastic Productions reactions. So just mind your business, okay? I love this channel so much. I love their content so much, and I'm really excited. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started.
It's a common belief among storytellers that storytelling is the most important facet of humanity, which is a very understandable bias for us to have. And while branding it the absolute pinnacle of human nature might be a bit indulgent, there's something dizzyingly awe-inspiring about the endless chain of tales and legends that links us through 100,000 years of forgotten names and vanished lives. Our roots run deep and dark through the forgotten places of history, stories so old we don't even realize how old they are. Some of those stories are stellar. In many places around the world, the Pleiades star cluster is referred to as the Seven Sisters, which is noteworthy because only 6 stars are visible, and in the myths, one of the 7 sisters is typically missing, dead or abducted or hiding in shame, leaving the other 6 behind. What's interesting is that there actually are 7 stars in the Pleiades, but 2 of them have drifted so close together that they cannot be distinguished with the naked eye. How does the myth know that there were once 7 sisters and that their number has been reduced? Well, there was a time when there were 7 visible stars in the Pleiades, 100,000 years ago.
Wow.
So maybe the story knows that they went from 7 to 6 because the story is 100,000 years old. Some of these stories describe a world that no longer exists.
That's so
Australian
cool.
Aboriginal mythology and folklore often warns of giant, dangerous creatures that align very closely with the megafauna that used to roam its plains, like the Diprotodon, megafauna that's been extinct for 40,000 years. Rock art in the region depicts marsupial lions that have been extinct for a brisk 30,000 years. It's very cool to catch glimpses of the truly staggering longevity of storytelling, but unfortunately these cases are the exception and not the rule. While the lineage of many myths and legends can be theoretically traced back thousands of years to key events in the archaeological record that may have shaped them, it's the nature of stories to change with every telling, which is why searching for crisp historicity in ancient legends is a recipe for madness. The evolution of stories is very similar to biological evolution. It's often the odd little consistencies across a seemingly unrelated menagerie that let us identify and trace back a lineage, and just like in biology, in the grand scheme of storytelling, almost everything is lost. We might want to find or reconstruct the original version of these ancient tales, searching for those truly ancient stories, but the original is gone, shattered into the branches of a family tree with the vast majority of its defining narrative lost forever, only scraps and hints and fragments cluing us into what shape the common narrative ancestor might have once taken. The great tragedy of this kind of research is that sometimes things are just gone. Paleolithic cave paintings are eroded away by wind and water. The key historical details in a legend are lost when the teller doesn't think them interesting enough to pass along to the next generation. A civilization's records are miraculously preserved, but the language they're written in dies out, and so the knowledge dies with them.
The thing about history is there are historical facts, right? But so much of history is subjective. So much of what we learn about history is subjective. And I truly love how eloquently Red describes the dilemma that historians have and archaeologists have. I truly love how eloquent Red is when she is describing the problem that historians and archaeologists have as they're trying to piece together the puzzle of what we know, what we could know, what we used to know. It's truly fascinating, but like she said, it could drive you crazy.
Geological upheaval buries a city under 100 meters of rock, and within 200 years, nobody remembers its name. Storytelling may not be the most important thing humanity is responsible for, but it is alive, and like all alive things, it dies very easily. This is why it is truly, genuinely incredible that we have the Epic of Gilgamesh. Before 1853, the Epic of Gilgamesh was a pile of broken pottery in an Assyrian ruin. Before 1872, it was a pile of broken pottery in the basement of the British Museum. It wasn't until Assyriologist George Smith translated the cuneiform in the Flood Tablet, which would later be known as Part 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, that it became clear that there was a story here, a coherent written narrative older than anything anyone had found before. It was only a fragment, but it told an epic tale of a cataclysmic flood very similar to the one in the Tanakh, and they still had a lot of broken pottery to go. There is no single complete version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The oldest stories about him we have access to are Sumerian from the 18th century BCE, where his exploits were literally used as writing homework for scribes, which is why we have about 5 million copies of them. In these poems, Gilgamesh is called Bilgamesh, and while a few details from the overall epic show up, like Enkidu being Gilgamesh's best friend and Gilgamesh overall being a totally badass king, it doesn't have a whole lot to do with the epic, and it's...
Just to be clear, and I get this from my world lit professor, Enkidu and Gilgamesh were definitely bumping purses, like, let's be for real.
It's clear that there was basically a corpus of episodic king. It doesn't have a whole lot to do with the epic, and it's clear that there was basically a corpus of episodic folklore about Gilgamesh popular in the cultural consciousness long before his story was consolidated into the epic. There was also clearly a prototypical version of the Epic of Gilgamesh in cultural circulation before it was locked down by the poet and scribe Sinlique Unini somewhere between the 13th and 11th century BCE, when he wrote down what is now considered to be the standard version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, or as it was called at the time, He Who Saw the Deep. Now, 3,000 years of wear and tear on the tablets has left the story somewhat fragmented, but because this tale was so popular in various forms, new tablets with chunks of the Epic of Gilgamesh are being discovered all the time. Every new translation is more complete than the previous ones because it has more to work from. This is the rare, beautiful case where a lost story was rediscovered, and instead of being half a fragment of a scrap of an oblique reference with absolutely no hope of recovery, it was literally an entire saga.
Which I recently learned is the case with Sappho. Like, we don't have a lot of her completed works, or I think maybe even any of her completed works. Like, everything we know about Sappho comes from bits and pieces. And I never knew because I didn't learn about Sappho, and obviously I didn't learn it in my Christian homeschooling program. And then I didn't learn anything about it in college either. So I had no, I thought we had like tomes and tomes of Sapphic poetry. So... which is, you know, just further proof of how amazing it is. But yeah, so I think it's really incredible that we have this almost entirely complete version of the Epic of Gilgamesh that that we keep building upon. Like, that's sorry, I just got like chills. That's so cool.
We've known about this epic, the oldest known work of literature, for less than 200 years.
Wow.
A combination of luck and skill and some very, very determined archaeologists have given us back something we could have very easily lost forever.
Also, the British Museum rolling up to take every Assyrian artifact that wasn't nailed down, but like, okay, see, colonization and looting is awful, but this one is a weird, complicated case because the excavated ruins were devastated by terrorist attacks in the 2000s, but also the invading U.S. forces also looted these sites, and the British Museum only returned the recently stolen stuff in 2018. And yeah, there's always this conundrum that you have as somebody who's interested in history, you know, and because, let's face it, a lot of our sources were looted. It's just an ethical dilemma that I think every historian has to face. Also, just an explanation for why the audio sounds a little bit weird. Red left a note that said, if you notice the audio got fuzzy around minute 4, that's because 12 hours after it went up, we got a manual copyright claim on one of the background checks that vampirized all the video monetization, which was an absolutely brutal no-win scenario. Been there, dealt with that. I'm so sorry that you guys dealt with it as well. They said they just had YouTube edit out the song and leave the narration as best as it could manage. So that's why it sounds like that. We're gonna suffer through it together. I'm so sorry.
And part of what makes the Epic of Gilgamesh so interesting is that its own narrative themes apply to it on a metatextual level. The Epic of Gilgamesh, a legend that was dead and forgotten for 2,000 years, is a story about death, legacy, and immortality. So let's talk about it. The story begins with a glowing attestation of the beautiful and magnificent city of Uruk, and an equally glowing description of Gilgamesh, a great hero king, unbelievably huge, powerful, and strong, most likely in large part because he is 1/3 man, 2/3 god. However, despite being a great king, Gilgamesh is kind of a terrible person, harassing the young men of his city in some unspecified way and harassing the young women in a very specified way.
Good tax policy and an impressive monster killing resume, 2 stars off since he bounced me like a basketball for half an hour in the courtyard of Nana's temple and banged my wife.
The gist is that when a young woman gets married, she spends her wedding night with Gilgamesh first and her actual husband second. This is not a great arrangement for anyone but Gilgamesh, and the women of Uruk are just about sick of it, so they this a young woman gets unspecified way and harassing the young women in a very specified way. The gist is that when a young woman gets married, she spends her wedding night with Gilgamesh first and her actual husband second. This is not a great arrangement for anyone but Gilgamesh, and the women of Uruk are just about sick of it, so they petition the gods for help. The gods roll up and deliberate what to do about Gilgamesh being a huge turbo tyrant, and eventually they decide the only logical solution is to create Gilgamesh's equal, someone who can stand up to him and make him chill out. The goddess Aruru, creator of humanity, shapes some clay into a massive and powerful wild man called Enkidu, an absolute and literal beast who spends his days in the wilderness with the animals, causing problems for the local hunters, which means the number of unstoppably powerful demigods causing problems for innocent locals has changed from 1 to 2. Good work, team. The hunters try and figure out what to do about this huge monster man that keeps wrecking their traps and freeing their prey, and they settle on the creative solution of calling in an expert on getting men to behave, the legendary prostitute Shamhat, whose reputation turns out to be well-earned because after engaging Enkidu for an entire week, the man has somehow learned language, showering, social skills, table manners, and how to immediately go at it for another week.
A week? That's okay. All right.
In between completing her Tarzan speedrun any percent, Shamhat tells Enkidu about the legendary king Gilgamesh, and he catches wind of Gilgamesh's abuses of power, and immediately resolves to go and fight him 1v1.
How dare he ruin the wholesome fun of consensual boning? That's a man. Now that's a man right there.
Gilgamesh, and he catches wind of Gilgamesh's abuses of power, and immediately resolves to go and fight him 1v1. Enkidu and Shamhat head to Uruk, and the people marvel at this strange, wild man, animalistic in nature, but just as strong and powerful as Gilgamesh himself. As Gilgamesh makes his way to the newest newlywed in town, Enkidu blocks his path and challenges him to single combat. They fight, and while the details of their clash are obscured by damage to the tablet, when the signal fuzzes back in, Gilgamesh and Enkidu stop fighting, kiss, decide to be best friends for life, and then Gilgamesh introduces Enkidu to his mom.
They were best friends.
Officially setting the first world record for the enemies to lovers trope, which has yet to be surpassed. A couple lines later, Gilgamesh decides on a whim that he wants to go and kill a big monster, a terrifying fire-breathing creature by the name of Humbaba. And when Enkidu asks why the hell they would do that, Gilgamesh calls him a wuss and goes to do it anyway. Absolutely nobody can dissuade Gilgamesh from this idea, so the two of them gear up and head to the forest of cedar that Humbaba guards. On the way, Gilgamesh has a series of scary symbolic nightmares, but every time he gets freaked out, Enkidu manages to explain why the scary symbolic nightmare is actually a good thing, and I'd love to give you more details about what the dreams were and how they could possibly be good, but sorry, tablet busted, who dis? All that matters is the boys make it to the forest of cedar, catch Humbaba's trail, and square up with him. Humbaba talks a little smack, Gilgamesh gets nervous, Enkidu affectionately calls him a wuss, and they fight, and with the help of a little bit of divine intervention, courtesy of Gilgamesh's goddess mom, Humbaba is pinned down by the wind so Gilgamesh can slay him. Enkidu briefly worries that killing a monster created by the gods might upset the gods a little bit, I'm sure that won't come back later. Or immediately! When the boys make it back to Uruk with a ton of high-quality cedar wood in tow, Gilgamesh gets himself cleaned up after his long and arduous journey and is immediately ambushed by the goddess Ishtar, who thinks he's really hot and wants to marry him. Gilgamesh enumerates a large number of reasons he's not going to do that, in the form of a list of all of Ishtar's exes that have suffered various horrible fates, and Ishtar gets really upset and storms back to the heavens in a rage. She asks her parents, Anu and Antu, if she can borrow the Bull of Heaven and have it kill Gilgamesh, and makes it clear that her alternative plan is to smash down the gates of the underworld and raise up the dead so they devour the living.
Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, as anybody can tell you.
Rather than dealing with the paperwork of an ancient Mesopotamian zombie apocalypse, Anu gives her the Bull of Heaven and she unleashes it on an unsuspecting Uruk. It's an absolute nightmare of a monster, with its very presence boiling the rivers and cracking the earth, but Enkidu and Gilgamesh manage to defeat it through the cunning strategy of hitting it really hard. They sacrifice various parts of the bull to various different gods, throw a party, and go to sleep. Job well done, boys. Unfortunately, Enkidu dreams that a council of the gods convenes to discuss how Enkidu and Gilgamesh can be punished for killing not one but 2 sacred creatures crafted by the gods.
Okay, but the second one wasn't my fault. The second one was really your fault for not reining in Ishtar. How are you gonna punish me? That's not my fault. That's not my bad. Y'all never taught her that people could tell her no. So now, because you got a bratty child, now I have to be punished? That's fucked up. That's rude.
The gods agree that one of them should die for it, and unfortunately for Enkidu, the reluctant consensus, even among the gods that like them, is that Gilgamesh is a lot less disposable than Enkidu. He wakes up heartbroken, knowing that his death is inevitable, and coming soon to a civilization near you. While Gilgamesh tries to petition the gods to spare him, Enkidu privately breaks down and laments to Shamash the sun god, cursing the hunter and Shamhat that took him away from his peaceful, ignorant, wild existence, and doomed him to a life weakened by civilization and knowledge, forcing him to forever be lesser than his great friend. Shamash gently chastises him for cursing the people that gave him his life and his friendship with Gilgamesh, and Enkidu...
Wait, I'm so sorry. She's narrating this beautifully, and there's music in the background. But then she lured me with bread and boobs and stuff.
Shamash gently...
And then the god is like, but did you like the bread? And he's like, yes. And the boobs? Oh, for sure. Like, there is so much humor that gets lost in overly sarcastic productions if you only listen to the narration and don't pay attention to what's going on screen. And sometimes I get a little bit distracted by one or the other, and it makes it hard for me to focus on both at once. So if I pause a lot during the video, that's why. It's because I'm really trying to get the full experience. And I'm trying to make sure y'all get the full experience too, because y'all have the added distraction of my beautiful face and my fantastic hair. So anyway, continuing.
He chastises him for cursing the people that gave him his life and his friendship with Gilgamesh, and Enkidu calms down a little. So to make up for cursing Shamhat, he turns around and blesses her to be incredibly home-wreckingly hot and have a lot of great boning for the rest of her life. Despite his little moment of closure, Enkidu's not resting peacefully quite yet. He has a second dream where a terrifying lion birdman attacks him and drags him into the sunless underworld, where he's paraded before a menagerie of death gods. When he wakes up, he's sick, and his illness worsens over the next 12 days. On his deathbed, Enkidu tells Gilgamesh that he feared dying in battle, but he now wishes he'd at least had the fame and glory of a violent death. A slow, lingering illness brings him nothing at all. Enkidu dies, and Gilgamesh is heartbroken. He commissions a massive statue of Enkidu, drains his treasury to commission sacrifices for the gods so that they'll favor Enkidu, and ultimately spirals into a full-blown existential crisis. In this state, Gilgamesh leaves Uruk and sets out for the farthest reaches of the world in search of a legendary man named Utnapishtim, who along with his wife are the only people who have ever become immortal. Gilgamesh makes his way through the wilderness, still quite powerful, but
it was like, I might not be built different, but I can become different. Y'all not finna get me like you got my boy.
Still quite powerful, but now also quite frightened thanks to his rolling existential crisis. So he's still defeating lions with his bare hands, but now he's sad about it. He reaches the twin mountains where the sun rises, guarded by two scorpion men who let him pass when he tells them he's seeking Utnapishtim. He travels through the dark, sunless void for 12 double hours before he finally emerges into a strange garden of stone and crystal trees at the edge of a vast ocean. An old goddess directs him to the boatman that can take him to Utnapishtim, a man named Urshanabi currently working in a forest with a large group of strange stone men. But Gilgamesh interprets her directions as instructions to fight Urshanabi and the stone men, which makes the process of getting to Utnapishtim extra complicated, because the stone men Gilgamesh smashes to bits are the people who are supposed to be manning the dang boat. Urshanabi and Gilgamesh end up having to man it themselves, including a rather perilous section where they need to pull the boat through a band of deadly water and improvise a sail out of their own clothes. But Gilgamesh finally lands unscathed on the far shore and meets Utnapishtim, who is very unimpressed with him. Gilgamesh asks Utnapishtim how he acquired immortality, and Utnapishtim tells him the tale. A long, long time ago, Utnapishtim lived in the great city of Shudapak, where one night the god Ea came to him in a dream and told him to forsake his house, abandon his wealth, and build an enormous boat, filling it with everything needed for life to survive. Ea does not elaborate why this is necessary, but helpfully provides him with a cover story for this apparent madness. If anybody asks, Utnapishtim has somehow incurred the wrath of the god Enlil, a notoriously volatile god of wind and storms, and so Utnapishtim has to go live in Ea's oceanic realm.
Now, does this story sound a little familiar to any of you guys? I will say no more.
Also says that he can tell the others that soon Shudapak will Utnapishtim has to go live in Ea's oceanic realm. Ea also says that he can tell the others that soon Shudapak will experience a rain of plenty, a shower of bread cakes, and a torrent of wheat. Ea's suspicious caginess and oddly meteorological metaphors clearly alarm Utnapishtim because he obeys without question, emptying his treasury and sacrificing his livestock to ensure his workmen are very richly compensated for building the massive ark as quickly and as well as possible. Utnapishtim loads up the boat with his family, some workmen and artisans, and a whole bunch of animals. On the day Ea warned him of, he seals the hatch, and the rain begins to fall. A deluge unlike any other drowns the city and drives the gods up into Anu's realm, most of them grieving the destruction and the death of humanity. After 7 days, the rain finally stops, and Utnapishtim cracks the hatch to survey the terrain. The outlook is not good. There's ocean as far as the eye can see, and only the highest mountain peaks are visible as tiny, barren islands. He grounds the ship on one of them and starts sending out birds to look for livable land, and after 2 failures, he releases a raven that flies far enough to see the waters receding. Utnapishtim makes a sacrifice to the gods, and being basically the only human alive and currently praying, all the gods turn up, including Enlil, who the other gods are none too pleased with, because it turns out Enlil is the one who came up with this dumb flood plan himself to try and fix overpopulation, and somehow convince the other gods to be sworn to secrecy about it. Enlil is furious that Utnapishtim survived, but Ea calls him a dingus for orchestrating this whole unnecessarily dramatic debacle, and Enlil calms down. He takes Utnapishtim and his wife and declares that they are now immortal like the gods, and decrees that they'll live far away from the rest of the world at the source of all rivers. So Utnapishtim and his wife are whisked away to this beautiful and alien land, and that brings them to today. Since Gilgamesh doesn't have the option of surviving a cataclysmic flood and convening every god in the world to talk about it, he's not entirely sure what he's supposed to take from this, so Utnapishtim tells him if he wants to conquer death, he's gonna have to start by conquering sleep. He challenges Gilgamesh to stay awake for 7 nights, which Gilgamesh declares to be child's play before immediately passing out. When he's eventually nudged awake, he insists it was only a brief doze, only to see that Utnapishtim's wife has helpfully baked him a fresh loaf of bread for every day he was asleep. There are 7 of them in total, 5 of which have become completely inedible. This is very disheartening for Gilgamesh, and while Utnapishtim won't give him a do-over, he does take pity on the poor guy and cheers him up with a nice hot bath and a makeover to get all the depression gunk off him. He also kicks out his boatman, presumably so nobody else winds up on his front lawn with delusions of grandeur. As Gilgamesh and the boatman go to leave, Utnapishtim gives Gilgamesh one more option to stave off the Reaper, a rare plant found under the ocean that restores the youth to anyone who eats it. Gilgamesh immediately dives in and finds it, and plans to bring it back to Uruk and test it on some random old guy before downing it himself, but then he leaves it unattended and a snake eats it. With Gilgamesh's pursuit of immortality officially completely pointless, and with no way back to Utnapishtim or the plant, he despondently returns to Uruk, and the story ends the way it began, with a description of the wonder and majesty of this great city, far greater than the life of any one man. There is something incredibly poignant about reading this story almost 5,000 years after its historical setting. If the historical Gilgamesh who ruled Uruk sometime between 2900 and 2350 BCE truly suffered the memento mori crisis that his fictional counterpart did, then it's a strange form of immortality he's found himself in. One, like Utnapishtim, granted by no action of his own, but by the choices of a group he had no power over. The people of Uruk told his stories for 1,000 years after his death before they were codified in the tablets we have now, a distant, abstracted immortality very far away from the world of the living. Gilgamesh could not have an immortal life, but when he gazes on Uruk and sings its praises in the final lines of the tablet, he hints at the immortality he will inadvertently achieve. He was terrified of death, but when he stopped running from it and returned to the city he lived to protect and rule, he became a king worth immortalizing, worth telling stories about for 2,000 years, stories then worth recovering and translating 2,000 years after that. Immortality is memory and legacy and history.
Absolutely.
It isn't outrunning death, it's outlasting it. Storytelling may not be the most important thing humanity's ever done, but it is how we share the gift of immortality with the people and stories that we love. And in a very real way, it's an honor to carry that on. But while we're talking retellings, look, I couldn't give less of a shit about the Fate franchise, but it drives me up the fucking wall that this is their design for Gilgamesh. This gold-plated broomstick? 2/3 god with a 6-cubit stride? You're telling me it's not this beefy muscle man? You're telling me that is supposed to be Alexander the Great, who did all of his best work before he was 25? It's a rare treat for the Fate franchise to have designs that even come close to making sense. But these designs would actually kind of work if you just switched them. And instead they did this. And I hate it. I hate it so much. I can't believe they do this to me.
That's really freaking funny. That's hysterical. Before we get into the final notes that Red always leaves on her videos, I kind of wanted to touch on what she said about legacy, because it really reminds me of in Hamilton, how Alexander Hamilton was obsessed with his legacy, with what he was going to leave behind when he died. And it also kind of makes me think of King Henry VIII, who was so obsessed with having a son that he divorced and beheaded several women in his efforts to have a son. And, you know, it turns out that he did have one, but then that son died. But he's still immortal. He, you know, the Tudor name is forever entrenched in history, mostly because of his daughter, right? Like mostly because of Elizabeth I and to a lesser extent Mary, but also because he was so garbage. Because he was so terrible. And it's just so fascinating to me that this became a self-fulfilling prophecy where Gilgamesh became obsessed with his legacy and immortality. I think that's really interesting how the concept of legacy and, you know, living beyond death or escaping death can really prompt some incredible and in some cases horrendous actions. All right, so Red says, for this video, I mostly referenced Andrew George's version, which is very good at being extremely specific about citing individual tablets and filling holes in the original text with cited alternatives from other source documents. It's also quite good at not overdoing the poetic license, so if you're looking for a very solid, robust version of the epic that's as close to the original cuneiform as you can get, I recommend this one. Gilgamesh is the exact opposite of the "that can't be it, where's the rest of it" meme. We're always finding new bits and bobs that make it hold together just that little bit better. For instance, back in 2015, they found a new tablet that clarified that Enkidu and Shamhat actually boned down for 2 weeks, thus, instead of 1. Meaning the trope of jarringly disruptive sex scenes that go on for way too long is literally the oldest literary tradition in human history. That's funny. This was a fascinating video. This was a fantastic and concise summary of the Epic of Gilgamesh. I would recommend reading it to anybody, but I fully understand that it's not for everybody. I think maybe people who aren't super interested in history or literature might find it a bit dry, a bit wordy, but it is honestly so fascinating and also very interesting to me that there haven't been a lot of adaptations of it to make it more palatable to the general public. But I feel that way about most legends, most epics and stuff like that. So it might be the nerd in me. It could be. I really hope that you guys enjoyed the video. Don't forget to leave your reaction requests and recommendations down in the comments below. And other than that, peace out, Hope Biscuits. It's Skittin' Lit.